So this morning I want to look briefly with you at the subject of idolatry. So just for a moment, I want you to think in your mind, when I say the word idol, what kind of images come to your mind? What are the kind of things that you initially think of when you hear the word idols? So I've just got a few examples. So these are what I would describe as stereotypical idols. So on the left there, we have the god of Baal, who was one of the so-called gods in the neighboring nations of Israel. So if you read the Old Testament in particular, sometimes you'll see the name Baal mentioned because he was one of those so-called gods that the neighboring nations worshipped. In the middle there we have the Roman god Bacchus. You'll see I've cropped much of his body out because for some reason Roman gods don't always wear clothes. And he was the god of partying. Yes, you heard that right. The Romans, they had a god of partying. And then on the right, we have a little statue of the Hindu god Ganesh. And often, when you mention the word idol, for a lot of people, this is what people think of. But as many of you may already know, actually, anything and everything can be turned into an idol. Anything can be almost given its godlike status in our lives. So, for example, something like family can be an idol in our life. You know, family is something that is really, really good, but sometimes we can take this good thing of a family and turn it into a God thing. We can idolize our spouse. We can idolize our children. Sometimes we idolize this kind of unrealistic, ideal, perfect view of what a family should look like. Meanwhile, we constantly compare our family as it is with this kind of ideal appearance, the ideal look of what a family is. Sometimes, of course, you can turn a football team into an idol. I went to watch Sunderland for the very first time a few years ago, and because it was the first time going there, I hadn't a clue what to do. You know, but everyone stands up at a certain point and everyone starts singing songs in kind of a tenuous way. It's almost like a bit of a worship service, how everyone stands up and they sing songs, and it got that element of worship built into it. But there's nothing wrong with football. I like football, but we can take something like football, a football team, a hobby, an interest, and bring it to an unhealthy place in our lives. Just another example. Sometimes we can even take things such as the desire to be liked and loved, which is a very normal desire. It's very normal to want to be liked. But sometimes we can elevate that to an unhealthy place in our lives. And in so doing, we turn this wanting to be liked, this wanting to be loved, into an idol, into this God in our lives. These two icons actually are borrowed from Facebook, and on social media often we see this amongst young people in particular, that you can almost get into this addictive cycle of you put a post out, you share a picture with your friends, and then constantly you're checking every 5 seconds to say, have anyone liked my post? Has anyone commented? Oh, no one's commented, no one's liked it, so I'm going to take it down and maybe put a different post on. And lots of people have been liking this one, and you can constantly check in and stuff, and then you can get into this addictive cycle. And I know addiction to social media is something that is definitely on the increase. But it's not just like that on social media. We can get into this cycle of, I need to be liked, I need to be loved. And so I'm not going to confront something that I probably should confront because actually I want to be liked. I'm just going to go with the flow. The point is this: we can pretty much turn anything and everything into an idol. And so I want to ask 3 questions. And this morning I'm primarily just focusing on the first 2 verses that were read out. So verses 8 and 9. Because in many ways, that's like the coat hanger that all the other verses hang from. So what Paul goes on to say basically flows out of these initial 2 verses, where Paul is actually talking about how sometimes we can idolize things. And I want to ask 3 questions. Number 1, what are idols? Secondly, how do they enslave us? Because one of the things we'll see in Scripture is whenever you see the idea of idolatry, you almost always see it associated with the idea of slavery. And then thirdly, what's the antidote to idolatry. So let's look at this first question. What are idols? Well, in verse 8, Paul says, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. In other words, Paul is saying here that there are things in our lives that by nature aren't God's, but sometimes we allow ourselves to become enslaved to them because we almost give them this godlike status in our lives, even though they're not actually God's. But then in verse 9, Paul continues and he says, but now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? So now in verse 9, he's describing these things that we make gods but aren't actually gods, and he describes them as weak and worthless elementary principles of the world. It's quite a phrase, that elementary principles of the world. So what on earth is Paul saying there? Well, the truth is, it's one of those phrases in Scripture that no one is really sure exactly how it's supposed to be translated. So here in the English Standard Version, the translation that we were reading from, it translates it as the elementary principles of the world. But if you were to read the King James Version, which is the version with all the these and thous in, it would just translate it as elements of this world. In the New Living Translation, basic spiritual principles. In the NIV, elemental spiritual forces. So you see that even in our different English translations, there's all these different ways of translating this phrase. But however we translate it, most commentators agree on what it is referring to. So whether you translate it as elementary principles or spiritual forces or elements of the world, most people agree that what Paul is referring here is to this pagan idea that behind every principle, every element, everything in the world would lie some kind of spiritual force, some kind of God. So, for example, behind the element of fire, there will be some kind of God. Behind the element of air and water, there will be some kind of God. Even with more abstract things like love and friendship and peace and war, there will be some kind of God, some kind of spiritual force that lay behind that. So, earlier I was showing some pictures of stereotypical idols. The middle one was Bacchus. And he was the Roman god of partying. Even behind things such as partying, there was this belief that there was some kind of god. Ares was seen to be the god of war. Aphrodite, the god of love and beauty. There was all kinds of these different gods, a god for this, a god for that, because they believed at that time that behind everything in the world was some kind of god. So, if your nation was at war, you would worship and pray to the god of war. If you were newly married and you wanted to have children, you would pray and you would worship the god of fertility. And you would pray to this god and pray to that god for whatever your need was in that moment. The point is, behind everything, there was some kind of god. That was the belief at that time. And this is what Paul is referring to. He's referring to this concept, this idea that behind everything, they believed that there was a God. Now, you might say, well, in the 21st century, things are very different now. But I want to suggest that actually, it's very, very similar today as it was to 2,000 years ago. See, we might not say that there is a God behind everything in the universe, but we might say that we can turn everything in the universe into a God. We might not say that there's a God of money, but we might say that you can turn money into a God. We might not say that there is a God of family, but we might say that you can turn family into a God, and so on. And this is what Paul is referring to here. He's saying that at one time, these Galatians were worshipping all these different idols, all these different gods. And we might think that idolatry is something of in the past, 2,000 years ago, but actually, it can still be true today. But everything in the universe, everything in our lives, we can take good things and we can turn them into God things. But I come back to the question again, what exactly is an idol? And a really helpful way of understanding this was actually from a guy called Augustine of Hippo. Now, Hippo is not a reference to the animal, but rather to the place he was from. And Augustine of Hippo was one of the most significant theologians in the early church. He was in the 300s, 400s AD. I was going to say BC there, AD, after Christ. And he suggested this idea called disordered loves. And basically the idea is this, that in our life we have all kinds of good things. Family, friends, a job, all kinds of things in our lives that we love. But the key thing is that we should love them in a particular order. So for example, we of course should love God supremely in our life. He should be number one. We should love God right at the top of the list. But then after that we might love our family. Then after that, we might love our friends, we might love our job. There's nothing wrong with loving our job, our career. And then after that, we might love an interest, a hobby, and different things. But idolatry happens when we move something that should be down here and we elevate it to a higher place. So for example, idolatry happens when you love money more than you love doing the right thing. Because suddenly you're opening yourself up to compromising on your morals. Idolatry happens when you love your job and your career more than you love your family. You see, there's nothing wrong with loving a career. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be successful. But actually, when you love success, when you love your career more than you love your family, suddenly you're opening yourself up to that temptation to neglect your family in your pursuit of success. And of course, the obvious example of idolatry is when we elevate anything above God. The point is, most idols are actually good things. We often think of idols as bad things. Often idols are good things that we've tried to turn into a God thing. We've elevated them to an unhealthy place in our life. We've started to put our hope in them, our sense of self-worth in them, our sense of value in them. And without us realizing it, we take something that, yes, we should love, but it should be down here. And suddenly we've elevated it to a higher place. And that can happen to absolutely anything. So that's what idols are. But now, secondly, how do they enslave us? See, in both verse 8 and 9, we see the word slavery. Verse 8, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. And then in verse 9, we have these elementary principles of the world whose slaves you want to be once more. And throughout the New Testament in particular, actually throughout the whole of Scripture, we always see idolatry associated with this idea of slavery. Why is that? Because idols always preach a particular lie. And the lie is this: if you worship me, you will be better off. If you get success in your life, everything will be perfect. If you manage to find a comfortable life, and that's something that often we can idolize, as soon as I get a comfortable life, then I won't have anything to worry about. If everyone has a good opinion of you, then your life will be whole. And so often idols will preach this lie that if you get this, life will be perfect. I actually came across a quote by a guy called David Foster Wallace, no relation of me. I think he's actually a Canadian author. He seems to be quite a well-known author, but I'd never actually come across him personally. And he, a number of years ago, did a speech at a graduation ceremony over in a big university in America somewhere. And he said this really insightful statement. Now, bear in mind when I read it, he's not a Christian. He's not religious in any way. If anything, he has a very, very secular outlook to life. So bear that in mind when I read this quote. It's quite a lengthy quote, but it's very interesting what he says. He says this: In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. And I find that a really insightful statement, especially considering he's not religious, he's not a Christian. This is someone, he's not spiritual in any way, but basically he's saying that everyone worships something. And one of the biggest advantages of worshipping God is that if you worship anything in this world, as he puts it, it will eat you alive. If you worship power, you'll always feel powerless. If you worship things and money, you'll always feel like you need more. It'll never be enough. Think of it like this. So here I've got an empty glass, and in many ways, we've all been created like this glass to be filled up. So this glass has been designed, created, so that it can store water. It can be filled up with water or some other kind of liquid. And we're the same. We've been created to be filled up with love, acceptance, and belonging, to be filled up with God. But so often we go through life empty. And every single one of us, everyone in the world will have an awareness that actually we're going through life and there's something not quite right. There's this emptiness that so often people feel. But this is what we try to do. We turn to the things of this world to try to fill ourselves up. And basically what we're trying to do is it's almost like trying to fill up this glass by catching the water vapor in the air. And we're spending all our time, and I'm looking to my family to get that sense of value and worth, and it's like trying to catch the water vapor to fill up the glass, and guess what? It's not going to work. And so sometimes we look to maybe our career or success for that sense of purpose, for that sense of identity, for that sense of value, and we try trying to fill up the glass by catching the water vapor in the air. And you know what? It's not going to work. And then maybe we think, okay, maybe if only people liked me, if only people loved me and accepted me, then I'll be full of that sense of love and acceptance. And so we try that, and so we're trying to catch the water vapor, trying to fill up the glass of water. And you know what? It will always leave us empty. Or to use the language of David Foster Wallace, it will eat you alive. Or the language of Paul, it will enslave you. See, so often we look to good things in our lives. Family, friends. These are good things. Things that God has given put into our lives to bless us. But so often we look to them to be our hope, to be our joy, to be the source of our contentment, to be the source of that sense of value and acceptance and love. They can't be those things. They're good things, but they're not God things. So what's the antidote? What's the solution to idolatry in our lives? And well, verse 9 alludes to this. Paul says this, "But now you have come to know God, or rather be known by God. How can you turn back again?" So these Galatians, they were once living in idolatry. But Paul is saying, okay, but now something's changed. Something's different. What is that change? What is that difference? You know God, or rather, God knows you. And now that that is the case, how can you go back to idolatry? In other words, these two things of being known by God and looking to the things of this world to be gods in our lives, they cannot go together. That's the solution. How do we deal with idolatry in our lives? Know God and be known by God. Because those things can't go with idolatry. Now here when it talks about knowing God and being known by God, it's not simply a head knowledge knowing of God. It's not like, okay, I know God and he knows my name, that's it. It's more than that. It's a deep knowing. In fact, the word know here, although it's translated from a Greek word, it's actually related to the Hebrew word yada, which actually refers to this deep, intimate, intense knowing of another person. So much so that in the Old Testament, this Hebrew word yada is often, but not always, but is often used in the context of sexual intimacy. So for example, in Genesis, when it says, and Adam and Eve knew each other, it's not saying that Adam and Eve knew each other's names. It's saying that they had such intimacy. They knew each other so much that they're basically making babies. It's that deep, intimate knowing of a person. So much so that often this particular word was used in that context. And so here when it talks about us knowing God and being known by God, it's not just a surface level, okay, yes, God knows my name. But rather we are in this deep, personal, intimate relationship with God, where he is our Father, we are his children. He loves us, he accepts us, he forgives us. And it's as we know God and as we are known by God that suddenly idols slowly fade away in our lives. Because it's just going back to this analogy of the glass. We spend all our lives trying to catch the water vapor to fill up the glass. But when we come to God and when we're known by him and we're loved by him and we're accepted by him, he is the one who fills us up. We become full of his spirit. We become full of his love. We become full of his acceptance. We know that we belong to a God who loves us. And we become full of him so much so that we're like, okay, family's great, but I don't need to be looking to my family to find my value and self-worth. Because I'm already finding that from God. My job, my career, I want to be successful, but I don't need to look to that to feel like I've achieved in life. I don't need to look to that to feel like I have any value in life, because actually I'm already getting that from God. See, when we know God and are known by God, we can allow the good things in our lives to be just that. Good things. Without trying to make them into God things. See, every single one of us will have a tendency to take the good things in our lives and to elevate them to an unhealthy place. And just as a closing question, I want you to think, what are those things in your life that you might have a tendency to idolize? What are those things in your life that you might have a tendency to place your contentment in, your hope in, your joy, your identity, your sense of value in? And I want you to really think about that question. Because so often, if you're anything like me, you listen to a sermon, you think, oh, nice sermon, and then 5 seconds later you kind of think, what's for dinner? Really think about that question. What are the things in our lives that we have a tendency to look to instead of to God? And we're going to sing a song in just a moment, a song that we are all very familiar with, called I Surrender All. And I want us to have in our minds those things that we have a habit of turning to, have a habit of idolizing. Surrender those things to God. Give them over to God and say, God, it's all about you. I surrender all to you. And so let's stand together and just sing this song as a way of responding to God.